Morning, everybody. Thank you for joining our application seminar today. We're hoping to run through the application form, talk to you a bit about the theme, some of the technical elements of the application, and answer any questions that you have today. So in terms of our agenda, I'll give you a quick overview of the application process and the form. Um, then I'll hand over to Simon from Astros, who will talk about the financial and economic assessment model. And then Peter Concannon from ACOM will talk through the technical inputs associated with the application. And then I'll just round off by telling you where you can find a bit more information and guidance. So just a quick overview of where we are today. So we are coming up to our round 10 application deadline, which is at the beginning of July. So assuming that most of you on this call are considering an application as part of that application round or potentially round 11. We have completed rounds 1 to 8, and we're looking to announce more projects over the coming months, which is really exciting. If you'd like to find out about the projects that have received funding so far, we held a Meet the Projects event a week or so ago. The slides are available for that event and the recordings as well. And there is also information on our website on our funded projects page as well. We will send around a short feedback form following the session today. Really appreciate your feedback. There's only a few questions, just helps us to improve these sessions for future participants. Great. So in terms of the guidance material that we provide to you, it's a fairly hefty document if you've had a look at it. We've recently, like 6 months ago now, feels like recently, updated the application guidance to include some clarifications which we hope make the application a little bit easier and help you to understand some of the rationale behind the things that we're asking for. So we've included more information around eligible costs because we were getting a few questions about that. Information around the timelines for assessment, and Simon will come onto that in a bit more detail when we go through the theme. Also information around the counterfactual technology, the consumer detriment test. We've updated some links and some of the rates that are included within the guidance. We've also provided more information on the scoring, how we score the projects, and a checklist for documents that you need to provide to us. So there's quite a lot of information in there. These are the new bits that have been added. So if you do have any questions or you think anything's missing, please do contact your business development manager, who'll be able to point you in the right direction, and we'll take on board any feedback that you have on the changes that have been made. If you want to access the application guidance, it's at the link on screen. You can go to our resources page at the tab called resources on the website, or just follow the link on your screen. So HNIP is a two-stage application process. We have a pre-application stage, and this is a high-level project overview and an eligibility check. It's fairly straightforward to complete. The application deadline for the pre-application stage is a month before the full application. So if you're looking to submit in the next funding round, hopefully you've already submitted your pre-application. We then review that and confirm that your project is ready to progress through to the full application stage. And at this point, you need to provide us with detailed project information and financials. We ask you to submit your application form and any supporting documents through our data and application system, our DAS, with the link on screen. If you have any issues with accessing that or using it, or want a bit more guidance, again, please speak to your business development manager. The application form itself is an Excel workbook, and hopefully most of you have had a chance to have a look through that ahead of this session today. We will provide feedback to you as to whether you are successful and you're able to secure HNIP funding. But if you're not successful, we hope this isn't the case, but if you're not successful, we will provide you with feedback at every point throughout the process. So if you're unsuccessful at the pre-application stage, we'll explain why we think your project isn't suitable, why you haven't met the eligibility criteria, um, and if you're at full application stage, you'll get detailed feedback from us. And this will be a formal written response from the team. I guess it's important to highlight that if you are unsuccessful, this doesn't mean that you can't reapply, and we will encourage you and work with you to improve your application for the next funding round if you wish to reapply. So just a reminder, please do send through any questions that you have for us. So the form itself is split into a number of tabs and different sections. So I won't run through these in any detail, but they are on screen for you. So we ask for basic contact information from yourselves. We ask for you to self-certify that you meet the eligibility criteria. A range of questions about your project specifically, some of the stakeholders that you're engaging with. And then, as I said, I'm going to hand over to Simon and Peter to talk about the technical and financial elements, but we'll be asking for information on that as well. The application form, again, can be downloaded directly from our website, tbheatnetworks.org. We do occasionally update the application form. You can see the version on screen here is version 5. Um, Please do make sure that you download the version from the website. If you do happen to be working off an old version, that's okay, but please do let us know because we're able to transfer your data over to the correct one. We know where the changes have been made, so we don't want you to have to duplicate any work if we do update the form. But please do bear that in mind. Before you start submitting, sorry, just before you start completing your application form, you might notice a couple of yellow bars that appear across the spreadsheet. You will need to enable editing and enable content before you can start completing the application form. We did have some questions around that early on, so just like to remind everybody. And you also need to accept the disclaimer, which will appear on the first tab. So we've tried to provide guidance throughout the application form. The guidance appears in a notes section next to the relevant cells within the form itself. You can see the red text on the right-hand side of the screen that they're the guidance notes. Um, for some of the questions, we'll ask you to submit evidence or references. Um, if you can do that as a separate document and then indicate within the application form where uh, that evidence base could be found, that would be really, really helpful from our assessment point of view. So please let us know the name of the document and where in that document you're providing that evidence. We also have a series of hidden questions throughout the application. So you may see sections of blank cells, and this is because there are questions that are linked to your response earlier up in the application form. So for example here, if you answered no to the question about having fully drafted customer agreements or contracts, then you'll just need to scroll down and move down to section 6, which would sit around here. However, if you answered yes, we will ask you further questions in relation to that particular area. So I guess the key thing is to continue to keep scrolling down until you reach the bottom of the spreadsheet, so that you don't miss any important questions that might fall underneath any of those hidden questions. So finally, just a few things to consider before I hand over to Simon. Please work through the entire workbook, answering all the questions as they appear, and scroll right the way down, as I said. Um, if we ask you to provide any evidence, please do so. This includes your funding plan and your financial model. If you're not able to submit the right information, you may lose marks. We may have to come back to you and ask clarifications, which will slow things down. Please make sure any documentation that you provide to us is up to date. Again, if it's not, we may need to come back to you and ask for clarifications, which could delay the process. As I've said already, please highlight where additional documentation is provided and where we can find that. If you're able to provide indications of key milestones, please do so. Don't leave your application to the last minute. So we're running the session a month in advance of the funding deadline, so the application deadline. We're available to answer any questions. We can set up one-to-one meetings with you and your team ahead of application to answer any questions that you have. So please do use us as you need to. All of the projects are expected to show that your heat network would have had a positive return without HNIP support. So we're looking for projects that have positive IRRs. The HNIP funding that we provide must be less than 50% of your capital expenditure for the construction of the project. It's worth bearing in mind that the closer you are to that limit, the less competitive your project is likely to be against others within the funding round. So just worth bearing that in mind when you're applying. Be wary of adding too much contingency into your project. All projects need some form of contingency, but there is a balance to be struck there. Our scoring criteria is based on a range of factors. So we look at the heat delivered divided by your gross grant equivalent and your carbon saved divided by gross grant equivalent. So the way we like to describe this, a project that is delivering more heat and greater carbon savings for a smaller funding request will score higher than others, and therefore is more likely to be successful in the funding round. And just to give you a bit more information there, so HNIP as a whole aims to achieve the metrics there. So what you'd be trying to do is achieve or exceed that ratio within your projects, and if you're able to deliver that, you're more likely to be successful than those that don't. Over to you, Simon.
Good morning, everybody. I'll just stick my video on for a second. I'm Simon Carman. I work for Astros Advisors. We're part of the Triple Point Heat Networks Consortium. We were responsible for building the financial and economic assessment model, the FEAM, and we operate it during the assessment process, and we engage with applicants in relation to the data that you guys have provided that feeds the model. So I'm keen to give as much information about the model, how it works, and how the data needs to be presented to ensure that you as applicants are able to represent your projects as accurately and as fairly as possible within the constraints of the application form that we've issued. So that's kind of my purpose. So as part of the application process, we ask you to provide your own financial model, which will suit your needs, but where we have specified a certain minimum requirement in relation to it. I'm not going to talk anything more about your own financial model other than to say it needs to be consistent with and kind of reconcile with the data that you provide in the FEAM sections of the application form. So, but there are some significant differences between the way you're like to present the data and information in your financial model with the way we ask for it in the FEAM. So, for instance, we ask for real figures uninflated within the FEAM. We assess on the basis of internal rates of return that are project internal rates of return, that are the pre-financing, that are pre-tax. You're probably much more interested in nominal post-tax, post-financing returns. So again, it's helpful for us to be able to step from your financial model in terms of the metrics it generates for your purposes through to the metrics that are reported on the basis of the way we calculate them. What I'm going to talk a lot more about though is the are the FEAM sections of the application form that Sam's already mentioned. These are the yellow tabs in the application forms, and they're the tabs that collect the data and the quantitative information about your project. The FEAM was built with a kind of standard project in mind, and the application form was set up for that standard project, and we tried to recognise the range of variability that there was likely to be around that. I think it's fair to say that there has been no such thing as a standard project during this process. All projects are genuinely unique, and in some cases it's not immediately obvious how your particular project data can best be presented within our application form, and we are very keen that if you're finding yourself in that position, have a conversation with your business development managers, who's your point-to-point contact, and they'll arrange for a session with us, and we can agree between us how best to present your data, and I'm very keen that happens. The reason I'm keen for this session to happen and for those kind of sessions to happen is because we have a relatively short window to assess applications, and we have essentially a very quick initial clarification window, which just addresses really obvious issues with the application, and then we have a slightly longer period of time that we will put together clarifications and come back. So we only really have one real opportunity to clarify, and we'd like to use that clarification window to do proper clarifications around understanding your project and about making sure that it's representing itself fairly and in the best light possible. That's what we'd like to use the clarification window for. What we often use the clarification window for is sorting out issues that that if I can be clear about what those issues are now, that there's no reason why they don't come in correct in the first place. So that's why I'm kind of doing this. So the financial economic assessment model is a model that was built bespoke for this process, the application process, and it generates the metrics for three of the four scored metrics. So there are four scored metrics in the application process. Total score out of 100. The four scored metrics give an application an overall score, and then applications within a funding round are ranked in accordance with the score. So the three scored metrics that the FEAM generates are the total heat generated divided by the gross grant equivalent to the intervention. So that's a kind of pound per heat generated score. The lower, the more heat is generated per pound of intervention provided by HNIP, the higher the score will be. Similar approach on carbon dioxide saved. So total carbon saved compared to a counterfactual divided by the size of the intervention. Again, the more carbon saved for the smaller the intervention, the higher the score. And then there is an assessed metric that's called future decarbonisation and expansion. The fourth metric that isn't scored by the FEAM is deliverability, which Peter will talk a lot more about later on. The FEAM, I guess, fundamentally, the financial bit of the financial and economic assessment model, so the F bit of it, is around assessing the amount of support that we think a project should get, and this is on the basis of a gap funding principle, where we recognise that a lot of heat network projects, the economics are below market in terms of the returns they're generating. We have a view on what a market return is, and although that is individual to individual applicants, so we actually ask you to tell us what your return requirement is and to justify what your return requirement is, and then we cite the FEAM sizes the level of intervention and the type of intervention to raise the internal rate of return that the project is making, the project internal rate of return as we look at it from where it is before an intervention to where it is after we've had some government intervention. So that's a principal purpose of the FEAM. You will assess that within your own financial model, and we will check that within the FEAM. It also carries out a couple of other tests that aren't scored, but that are kind of pass-fail tests. So there's a social net present value test, which I'll talk about in a second. There's a customer detriment test that tries to recognise that particularly residential and social residential customers shouldn't pay more under the heat network scheme, particularly under a heat network scheme supported by government, shouldn't pay more than they currently pay. And then it does a state aid assessment, although that test, with us having left the EU, is now not as key as it was, although we're still in the midst of a developing new state aid regime, and I think our assumption is that if it's okay under the old state aid rules, then it's almost certainly likely to be okay under the new state aid rules. So we still pay a bit of attention to that, and we may come back to you if we think there might be an issue in relation to how much government support has been provided to your project. Sam, could you? Thank you. Okay, so the SMPV, way back at the start of this scheme, there was a pilot study, and part of the business case for the HNIP pot of money that was provided by government was that it would generate positive social net present value to society. So it was required that the program test individual project SMPVs, and that the program aggregates the individual project SMPVs so that we can demonstrate that for the money that's been given to this program, the expected amount of social value has been delivered. So that was a requirement of the project from government. SMPV is a peculiarly public sector calculation of value, and it's and if you're steeped in it, it's fairly understandable. If you're not particularly familiar with it, it can be a bit impenetrable. So the pilot study asked applicants to calculate the SMPV. As part of this process, applicants to calculate SMPV. That has an advantage in terms of it removing a fairly what we thought was an onerous requirement on applicants, but it has a disadvantage in that that there's a bit of a black box calculation done that you're not particularly aware of. And so the SMPV basically calculates the cost of the project in cash terms, discounted over time, compares it to the cost of a deemed counterfactual. So you tell us what the counterfactual is for each of your customers. We have a set of standing data within the FEAM that calculates up the capital and running costs for that counterfactual, and you compare the two, and then the social bit of it is adding in the social cost of the carbon that's generated by the scheme and the carbon that's generated by the counterfactual and other emissions. So that's valued in a pound sense. So what we're looking for is for the social net present value of the scheme to be the social net present cost of the scheme to be lower than the social net present cost of the counterfactual. If it isn't, then there is a process that we can go through with BEIS to sign it off for support in any case if the scheme is deemed to be strategic, and that's strategic as measured against a set of laid out criteria, and the criteria for being strategic are laid out um, in the application guidance. Otherwise, we would hope to engage with you during the clarification process if we thought there was a problem with your SNPV in terms of how we calculate it, to make sure that issue isn't to do with the way you've presented your data rather than an actual reality. So again, we talk to the business development managers so that we understand the technical characteristics of your projects, and we have a feel for whether we think your project is likely to be strong in this area or not so strong in this area, and if we get an incongruent result with the model, we'd like to engage with you to try to understand that better and sort it out. We also, if you want to provide us with a mostly completed data for the yellow tabs of the application form, we can plug it into the FEAM and give you feedback on SNPV before the application deadline, so we can have that conversation with you in advance of the application deadline, if you'd like that, or if you think you might be concerned that there might be a problem with that. Okay, Sam. Okay, the counterfactual is quite important in the FEAM. So the counterfactual is one half of a number of calculations or a number of comparisons. The counterfactual is it's effectively what an individual customer or an individual building, how it would be heated if it weren't for the fact that the heat network was going to be implemented. There are a relatively limited number of choices that we provide against each of the customers for you to choose what your counterfactual is, and the choice of counterfactual for customer will has a fairly big bearing on the numbers that are calculated within the FEAM. So the counterfactual is used as a comparison for the customer detriment calculation. So we look at the kind of levelized cost of heat or the unit cost of heat for the scheme compared with the unit cost of heat for the different customers against the counterfactual that you tell us what the counterfactual is, but our numbers calculate what the counterfactual outputs are. So the customer detriment is used. The SNPV test that I've just talked about, it uses it, and the amount of carbon saved, the metric, one of the three scored metrics, the amount of carbon saved, is a comparison of your scheme carbon generation compared to the counterfactual carbon generation. So it's a fairly important part of the FEAM. And this is one of the easy mistakes that can be made. There is a column, and I might show it to you if I get a little bit of time. There's a column in the demand input sheet which has this drop down list, and if you don't fill that in, then the whole model just doesn't work. And that would be your first clarification question. Okay, and again, it's a bit of a black box. I'm afraid we don't issue the FEAM to the market, and although we're happy to explain what our baseline data sources are, we don't go into much detail about the counterfactuals, and the counterfactual numbers that we calculate in our model, I can guarantee will be different to the numbers that you calculate in your model, but hopefully within an order of magnitude agreement. Okay, thank you, Sam. I'm not really sure how useful this is. This is in lieu of us providing the model. It's just a schematic of how the model works. Really, this was an early diagram that we produced when we were building the model. So we have a set of inputs at the top. We have inputs in relation to the project that come from your yellow FEAM data input sheets. We have some cash flow inputs, the capex, the replacement capex, over time, revenue costs, operational costs, and fuel costs. We have some physical inputs. We have capacity and demand. We have fuel demand for different customers and different technology types. So we have some standard physical metrics inputs as well. They go in to calculate a cash flow and undertake the intervention calculations, where we have very simple cash flow analysis that has all the cash going out over time, all the cash coming in from charging for the heat over time, pre-tax, pre-financing, calculates an internal rate of return, and then we then add in, say, a grant as cash going in, and that will push the IRR up. So that'll give you your pre and post intervention IRR, and we have a macro that solves and sizes either a grant or a loan to hit a target IRR. The left-hand side also feeds into the state aid calculation, and then becomes the comparator for the right-hand side of the calculation, which is the counterfactual. So we have a load of standing inputs on the counterfactual, which is base, forward curves, fuel costs, etc., all publicly published information. It generates counterfactual costs by technology based on the counterfactual type you tell us, and it calculates the SMPV, and it does an energy calculation and a carbon calculation, compares it with the project to calculate carbon saved, etc. And it feeds into the SMPV calculation. And right at the bottom of them are the key outputs: the heat generated, the carbon dioxide saved, decarbonisation and expansion, future decarbonisation expansion, and the SMPV benefit, customer detriment. So that's kind of how the model works. So the model was built entirely bespoke. We didn't start with a model and adjust it. We started with, what are the outputs that it needs to provide, what's the process that it's supporting, and what is the minimum data set that we need to generate those outputs. And we have tried really hard. It might not seem like it, but we've tried really hard only to ask for data that we think is necessary to support the application process. There's a temptation where data exists, just ask for it, but we've tried not to. So we hope it's the minimum data set we need to generate the answers that we're looking for. We've produced a FEAM rather than using individual applicants' financial models. We have a standard model. It helps ensure consistency of treatment between applications, and we can understand why there are differences between applicants, rather than trying to understand what the differences are between different financial models. We've obviously done thorough model assurance on the FEAM, which removes the requirement for us to model assure models submitted by you guys. We also have within it some checks that enables us to link into the technical proposals, and we have some checks within the application form itself that checks data consistency between different elements of the data sets. Again, I can talk a little bit more about that. So we've got green ticks and red crosses in the application form. A requirement of BAYS to the delivery partner was for us to put some thought to how we reduce the ability of applicants to game the application. So gaming, in my view, is around misrepresenting the project data in a way that helps maximize the size of the intervention that is sought. And we've put a lot of thought into how we best achieve the most accurate representation of a project, and having our own model with its own constraints that we've built in has helped us to do that. And the model also calculates SMPV and removed the requirement to calculate it from applicants. So that was the reason for For the model, I guess the reason for not issuing it is principally around gaming. That we don't really want you guys to have the model and to be able to just randomly change inputs to see what the effect on the score and what the effect on the level of intervention is. So that's the principal reason for not having issued it to the market. Okay, Sam. I haven't got a huge amount more. So we have there's actually another sheet. I should perhaps have updated this. There are 6 yellow sheets prefixed with FEAM. And these sheets, the yellow sheets, the way it works is that we receive your application form. We have a template blank FEAM, and what we do is we just link the FEAM to your application form, and then all of your yellow data, all the data in the yellow tabs just then links automatically through to all those equivalent forms are in our model as input sheets. That all that data is just automatically pulled through, and then the model just does its calculation. So if you were able to add a row in somewhere or add a column in somewhere, it would just break everything because all the linkages would not align. So please don't be tempted to do that, even though we've tried to lock it down. So there are these sheets. There's another sheet called the FEAM pipe schedule, which actually doesn't do very much at all in the FEAM, but it's another sort of quantitative data for the assessment process. The FEAM network input sheet basically has technical data about the generation sources and all of the key financial summary information. The demand input sheets is a sheet that is focused on the buildings, on the occupiers. So it asks for profile demand by building and some data about those buildings. The FEAM cost input sheet has a considerable amount of detailed cost data that gives cost build-up, cost of various items, the capex, the replacement capex, and the operating costs and the fuel costs at a detailed level in the cost input sheet. And then there are 2 specific sheets that calculate this future decarbonisation metric. Could I just whiz through, and you might want to make a note of these, just a couple of what we call the golden rules. These are the things that if they're not right in the application form, they will stop the FEAM from working. So we need numbers in pound thousands. It presented in the financial numbers provided in pound thousands. The counterfactual is calculated in pounds thousands. If you give us numbers in pounds, it will make your scheme look 1,000 times more expensive than the counterfactual, which will be an immediate clarification and will take you some time to sort out, I imagine. We need 60 years worth of data. Again, this is driven from the SNPV calculation, which is an economic assessment over the deemed life of the longest lasting assets, which was agreed at 60 years. So because the numbers are real, you can block the numbers out or copy the numbers out for 60 years. So what we typically see is if you've got a piece of generation technology that lasts 15 years, then we'll see 4 blocks of identical inputs over the 60 years of inputs. And although your concession might be for 25 years, or you might have absolutely no idea what you're going to replace your initial generation technology with in 45 years time, it's just from a practical reason, we just need to find a way of getting 60 years worth of data. And again, everything breaks if there isn't. I've already mentioned that our numbers need to be real terms, no inflation, please, and we can spot whether there is. And again, that breaks things. With all the other units, all the technical units, just have a little look at what the units are. If we ask for kilowatt hours, if you could give us kilowatt hours rather than megawatt hours, or if we ask for pence per kilowatt hour, don't give us pound per kilowatt hour, etc., etc. The units are important. Please don't include. You would expect you to include business rates in your financial model, but please don't include it in the as a cost in the FEAM data input sheets. The reason for that is that the government, at a policy level, doesn't want to be providing government grant out to support taxation coming back in again. So that's just a technical thing. Please don't include business rates. Please also don't include commercialization costs. The commercialization application is relatively straightforward as part of this process. We just ask for a plan of commercialization activities and an estimate of the cost of carrying out those activities, and then you can apply for funding support for those activities. It's assessed completely outside of the FEAM, so if you were to put the commercialization costs in, then there would be technically that could then you could end up then getting the commercialization support twice. So where we spot that, or if that happens, we'll ask you to take it out. And then and then there is one particular cell on the FEAM network input sheet, which actually I might just show you. If am I able to share my screen, Sam, just quickly?
Yeah, sure.
Find it. Okay, so this this is the FEAM network input sheet. You can see the yellow tabs across the bottom. Is that big enough for people? Can you see that, Sam? So the top of this sheet are the different generation technologies and the technical information we're asking for. At the bottom of this sheet is a quite important block of data. So this is where at a summary level the the revenues are shown profiled, and then the costs are shown in cash terms: capex, repex, operating cost, fuel costs, etc. And down here in this cell, which is I642, it calculates the internal rate of return. This will be the internal rate of return that our FEAM generates. And if you put some numbers in terms of revenues, I don't know. And then you put a little bit of costs in. It generates an indicative internal rate of return. If you want to put your intervention, if what you're asking for is a grant, if you want to put your intervention in here, then as some kind of other income, not in our application form, but just to try to check it for yourself, so you can stick something in down here. That will give you your post-intervention IRR as calculated by our model. So you can just sense check how these numbers are going to look from our perspective. But this number down here needs to be above 0. The pre-intervention IRR needs to be above 0. That's a scheme eligibility criteria. These crosses are the internal consistency checks, and they come from. So they will say, right, the total capex cost here is 200, but you've got no capex analysis in your cost input sheet. So if you put that in, that probably gets rid of that. That then no, it doesn't. Anyway, it should do. If it was in the right year, it would do. So so these checks are for your information and to help you. And if you're perplexed as to why you've still got a reconciliation check error, again, please just give us a shout, and we'll try and help you with it. Probably one more thing in relation to the future decarbonisation. So the future decarbonisation network, what we're saying here is you put in an initial generation technology, say it was gas CHP, it's increasingly unlikely that it will be for current applications, but say it was gas CHP, you put in a initial gas CHP and you say in 15 years time we're going to replace it with something more carbon efficient, then this index number here, so you say what your future technology proposed, you might you choose a air source heat pump or something, and then you would say this technology index is the number in the FEAM network input sheets. It's the number, it's the technology type number. So the first one, technology number 1, that's probably your main technology, that's CHP. So the index number in there would be 1. So you're replacing and it'll pull forward the description of it and how likely it is to do that. That will then provide us with the amount of fuel that you're generating, and that will then that you're using for that input type, that'll then generate additional carbon savings from changing to a more carbon efficient heat source. Similar kind of logic for the future demand. So here you're going to say, here's a whole bunch of other customers that we haven't included in our initial scheme because we're not certain enough about them, but we know, for instance, there's a master plan with a local authority that has got a plan to build out a massive new residential development, and it's right next to our heat network. We think we would be going after those as customers. So we'll add in those customers, have an estimate of what the demand is that they're likely to be requiring, and a little bit of information about it, and it'll generate an additional benefit to the project from those future customers. If you don't provide us with anything here, you won't get any score in this place. This is one of the 3 scored criteria. So the future decarbonisation score is the sum of the changes to the generation technology and the customers. And if you don't give us any information in either of these 2 sheets, you just won't generate a score. So pay a little bit of attention to that as well. Okay, so that's probably all I've got to say on this sheet. I don't know whether I had any more slides, Sam, or whether I've finished. Oh yes, sorry. Okay, we've provided a clarification in relation to timescales. This is we have a lot of different timescales within the model. We calculate different metrics over different timescales. The project carbon saving is calculated over 15 years. The project heat delivered is calculated over 15 years. So it's the sum of those 2 numbers over 15 years. Future decarbonisation and expansion is calculated over a 30-year period, but the new customers or the new technologies need to be implemented before the end of year 15. If you put information in relating to year 15, then you'll get one year for years 0 to 15 benefit, and then a further 15 years from years 16 to 30. So that's how that timescale works. The intervention appraisal period, so the internal rate of return in that cell I642, that's IRR is calculated over 40 years. The SMPV is calculated over 60 years, as I've already measured, and for good measure. We have a 25-year timescale for the state aid test, but as I've said, that's becoming less critical now that we've left the EU. That is me finished. Happy again to take questions either now, or if you want to have a go at filling in those sheets, have a go, and then if you have detailed questions about your specific project in terms of how to present your data, then please do get in touch.
Okay, thank you, Simon. I'm Peter Concannon. Look at the cost and deliverability side of the application. So cost assessment is one of the major issues that we look at from the assessment and of deliverability. Are the costs reasonable? Do we have a good budget that is robust? The actual data that we assess is, as Simon's pointed out, entered into the FEAM. So I'm going to just go through some of the thought processes behind the cost data entry and what we're really looking for. So next slide, thank you. We're looking to get a cost modeling is based on whole life cost of the project, with particular emphasis on the construction costs, because we're obviously supporting those directly with grant or loan, and we want to make sure that they're robust so that as you develop the project and get towards a final fixed cost, that they don't suddenly come up with any large changes that could derail the project. But we do also look at the replacement costs of plant over the life of the scheme, and the maintenance and operational costs. Next slide, please. So in terms of the capital costs, we break that down into 6 different sections. We want to see costs broken down for the energy centre, the distribution networks, which could be all 3 if you've got a complex project, but more usual just to be heat distribution. We've then got an allowance for internal customer components. So if you are replacing, let's say you've got an existing building and you're having to put internal pipework in to go from a connection up to individual dwellings, that would be part of the internal customer inputs. And then the final category that we have is the project costs, which are things like contractor overhead and profit, design fees, contingency, risk, so overall project costs. This is probably the hardest category for us in terms of the way people represent things. So quite commonly we will find that the capital cost for a piece of plant will include project costs, or people will have already added risk to all their individual cost items, so it's not an item in its own right. That's fine, but if you do that, please explain it to us, provide some form of explanation of what you've done, because that will then allow us to adjust our cost model or take account of that in our comparison, and we're not coming back to you asking you unnecessary questions. So certainly we would like to see some evidence of how you've come up with your risk costs, how you come up with your other allowances and for uncertainties, and where you have, whether you if you've provided those as an identified on cost, that's fine. If you haven't, you've amalgamated it into the capital plant items, then please identify that for us as well. Okay, next slide, please. So those five, so when we're entering information, we try and obtain as much detailed information about each cost item as we can to understand what it is. And the more detail you can give us, the better it is for our comparison point of views, because it allows us to understand where variances may occur, whether they are legitimate or whether we think there's a problem there. So we have three levels of description for each of the cost items that you enter. The first tier is very broad and relates to the 6 categories I mentioned above. So you would either say that the cost item is something to do with the energy center or the heat distribution or internals, or it's a project on cost. Very broad and simplistic. But then we also have then tier 2, which allows you to provide some further clarification about what the item is. So if we've got an item under energy center, is it part of the built, is it something to do with the built asset? Is it to do with the energy supply? So the heating plant itself or generation plant itself, or is it a utility or other? There are other series of descriptors to choose from. In each case, there's you're presented with a drop-down menu. Please pick from that menu. If you type something in, it will cause all sorts of problems, and we'll end up having to come back for clarifications. The descriptions may feel that they don't suit, but please pick the most appropriate one that you can. There's then a third tier of descriptor, which again breaks down into more detail yet again. So under the built asset, it could be part of the superstructure, it could be part of the substructure, it could be external works, it could be internal finishes. So something that basically tells us what component of the built asset that you're actually putting a cost against. Energy supply could be that it's the low carbon heating source, or that it's a non-low carbon heating source. It could be that that there's also a mechanical electrical category at tier 2. So you could then say that in tier 3 you might have to enter that they're the distribution pumps, or that it's the internal pipe work. So that we get more information again on the detail of what each item actually is. And the more you can give us, the better, as I say, trying to use the best descriptions that suit your particular cost item. So next slide, please.
Peter, I can just see that Peter North is typing a question. I don't know, was it on a specific slide, fine. Peter? I can see that you're. There we go. Great.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perhaps I can talk through it. So I was just interested in the certainty and level of detail of these costs. So, you know, if you're working for a local authority, for example, and you're a consultant, and you've developed the project costs, and there's a shortfall in the economics that they want to make a grant application for. And sorry, I didn't join at the beginning, so I might have missed this. Is it sufficient for the consultant to work up the levels of cost to identify the grant application, for example, or is it best left to go into market, keep your fingers crossed, and get the contractor to put more accurate costs in? So it's really the strategy around developing these costs, and when the interested parties intended to make the application.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Well, it's actually, you haven't missed it because it's on later slides, but the level of evidence, or the level of one of the questions we will ask you is what your data source is, whether it's a QS estimate, whether it's a benchmark, whether it's a contractor quote, or whether it's whether you've actually gone out for a D&B tender and it's a tender return. Clearly, the closer to market that you can get. So if you've got a D&B contract, then clearly your costs are very strong, and therefore you will score better than if you have a QS quote, QS estimate. But having said that, it's what's appropriate to where you are in the application process. So if you are at the commercialization stage, then you aren't going to have a D&B quote, and we wouldn't expect you to. You might have gone out to market for certain pieces of plant, major pieces of kit, particularly if they're a bit they're not common in the market. So if you're going for a large scale ammonia heat pump, then you may well feel that you want to get a price out of a supplier. But it wouldn't be unreasonable for you to use QS estimates for most of the rest of the costs.
Okay, so
does that explain? Is that clear?
Sort of, yes. So the local authority might wish to procure through the concession route, which has come up in HNDU round 11 guidance. So they're relatively hands-off. So they wouldn't be buying the bits and pieces of kit. It would be an ESCO who would be appointed, and if the DPD stage identified the grant shortfall, to get some sort of indication of grant and grant offer, obviously not in principle, would get the market a lot more interested in bidding for this. Whereas if it was, we think there's a shortfall, we need you on board, and then make the application for us, is really what best suits perhaps a concession approach.
Okay. I mean, it would be perfectly reasonable to put in QS estimates. So you could base your application on QS estimates in that instance.
Okay, thanks.
I mean,
Thanks for that.
you presumably must have some, even on a concession model, you will want to have some idea of the capital, because you'll want to know what you're getting in a concession tender return.
So this really goes through to the DPD consultant's brief, the level to which the information needs to be extracted, and therefore it impacts the cost of the DPD work. And that's what I was trying to get a feel of. But I think you've answered the question. Thanks.
Okay, good. Thank you. So actually, this is the slide that we would have discussed these things. So we look at CapEx, and as I say, we look at RepEx and OpEx. So the operational costs excluding the fuel costs, but the costs for running the plant and running the network and for maintaining it are all the data is all entered again in the FEAM input sheets. As we say, that the major stress is on the CapEx, but we need, because it's a life cycle cost analysis, we need to make sure that you've made reasonable allowance for replacement of plant, and that you've got allowances for maintenance and the operation of the network. We assess it against 3 different criteria. So the more detail you can give us in the cost plan, the better, and that relates to the tiers of descriptor that you use. If you just give a lump for the cost of the energy center, it may hit the same metric that we have in our model, but it's not very detailed. It doesn't really suggest it doesn't suggest that you've gone into the assessment in any detail, and therefore it makes us less comfortable, I think, with the costs, would be the way I describe it. I'm not sure I like number 2 being called accuracy, because it's a difficult one, but it basically we generate a shadow cost plan based on the information you tell us about what the plant is and what the scheme is. So again, that relates to inputs from the FEAM, which is why it's very important that you, again, to reiterate Simon's point, that you choose something from the drop down menus, because if you don't, it doesn't appear in our cost plan because it doesn't recognize the name. And basically we will create a shadow budget that that we think that gives us what we think is the cost. We'll then have to compare that with your budget and compare it and make sure that we haven't got any project specific things that are a bit difficult to for a standard model to cost. So if you have a ground source heat pump with a closed ground loop, that's not something that will appear in our model. But if we know that that is in there because that's been put in your supporting evidence and you've put some note about it in with your costs, then we can adjust our model to take account of those sorts of things. This is where using the very simple descriptors only makes life quite difficult, because if there is a big variance, it's difficult to understand why that variance is there, because we don't have the detail to go and identify what the different costs are. Clearly, this is where the source of the costs is quite important as well. If you have a D&B contractor's quote, then clearly your cost is right regardless of what our model says, because that's what you will pay. If you have a benchmark, then clearly we're a bit concerned, because if there's a variance, it may be that benchmark isn't most appropriate. So we may come back and ask for more information on that. So trying to provide us with as much explanation of how you've derived your costs is useful, because it saves us having to come back for clarifications where there are variances to our model. Evidence. If you have a quote, then we'd like to see something that evidences that, please, so that we can confirm, because again, this just goes to the lack of evidence. Answering the question is one thing, but if you can't evidence it, then how do we know it's not a gaming issue? And obviously in the values that you provide in any evidence need to match what you've put in your cost inputs. Next slide, please. So this is just an example of the cost input FEAM cost input sheet. Again, we've got a number of descriptors. The descriptor can be very useful for us, because sometimes the categories that are provided in the automatic drop-down categories that are provided to describe the items aren't always suitable, or aren't people misinterpret things. But if you've given us a clear description of that item, that makes life a lot easier, because we can then get, it's another piece of information that helps us understand what it is that you're actually costing there. So please try and put a good descriptor in. So clearly here we've got the energy center costs. We've broken it down then into built assets, the supply, mechanical services, electrical services, and the project on costs, which you can see there. So contractors, prelims, overheads, legal costs, financial design, project management, risk, contingency, optimum bias, which again is something that local authorities understand, but isn't used much in the private sector. But basically, you know, how much have you been optimistic? What's the real cost likely to be? Have you been over optimistic with your costs in terms of, you know, that they'll be lower than they actually will turn out to be? So next slide, please. Right. So in terms of the REPEX, so there are two different types of REPEX here. We've got, if you look to the CapEx type, 1, 2, 3, 4, which is the fifth yellow column, then for the initial capital, you will put initial CapEx in there. When you come to the replacement, then you can either have replacement costs, which would be during the life of the plant. So if you have a CHP that has a 15-year life, you have a 30-year, sorry, a 60-year project. So you would put in the cost of replacing that, and then you would say what the useful economic life is, 15 years, and that would again get entered in 4 times over the 60-year life of the project. End of life capital is really if you have your concession model, then your concession comes to an end. What's the residual value that you might be able to recover from that item at the end of the concession, which may or may not be at a replacement point within its life cycle. And again, the description is exactly the same. So you would normally expect, you know, you might well expect to see that you've got a condensing boiler in the capital, initial capital, but you've also got condensing boilers in the REPEX, a line in for REPEX over the life of the plant. Okay, next slide. So we also look at the maintenance costs. So again, for major items, you've got again, you would expect a line in here. It's not the same table. There is a separate table for maintenance within the same cost input spreadsheet. The descriptions again come across exactly the same. And so again, for boilers, there's a line in here for boiler maintenance. So that completes the costings for the boiler, apart from the fuel, which is calculated based on demand. But then there are other items that are non-plant capital related, so things like water treatment, ongoing water treatment, ongoing staff costs, metering and billing, costs of those natures, so that we understand all the costs. Again, as Simon was saying, taxes should be kept out of this, because we are not supporting the payment of taxes. So please don't include those, even though I appreciate there will be an ongoing cost. Next slide, please. Okay, so yeah, more detail that you can provide us, the better. please try and avoid the category other where possible, and if you can't, then please try and provide some explanation. If you need to provide a separate supporting document, that's fine. If you just reference that there's a space usually for referencing that in the input sheet, and then that will help us understand what it is that you're describing. Again, as Simon alluded to, don't enter items that aren't relevant to the actual capital application. So anything that's already installed shouldn't be included. Ineligible costs generally wouldn't be included. So if, for example, you are also including a private wire, but that private wire is supplied, say, from a wind turbine rather than a CHP engine, then the wind turbine and the private wire are not eligible. So ineligible costs would be excluded. Yeah, the costs need to be comprehensive so that we have the full project cost. As I say, we don't really, as the project goes out to tender, we don't really want to find that there are some nasty surprises because something's been missed out, and the costs, the tenders come back much higher than anticipated. So try and make sure that you include for all the costs that are going towards the project. Again, we would like to see some evidence. So if you say you've got a D&B tender, then we'd like to see something that proves that you do have that tender and that the cost in there is as you've provided, so that we can confirm that that's correct, and that clearly the stronger the evidence, the better. But obviously we expect the evidence to be in line with where you are in the project development process. If you're unsure about the costs, or what might be eligible, what might not, what level of detail, please do speak to your BDM, and they will arrange usually for one of the AECOM team to come to speak to you and to try and help resolve any questions that you may have. Any questions? Happy to take those. Okay, I'll go on to the deliverability then. So costs is one of the deliverability scores. We are looking here to understand how well the project is developing and looking for evidence that the project can actually be delivered. So again, the more information we have, the better. But we understand that the level of detail that will be available for any given application will depend where the applicant is in the development process. So the main application form, the non-FEAM application, is all about delivery, or is predominantly about deliverability. There are a lot of questions, and each one will have a relatively small impact on the score, but what we're looking for is the overall summation of the evidence that we're getting, and we're looking for information on the 7 categories there. So we're looking for information on the stakeholders relevant to revenue, non-revenue, program and technical costs, which we've already been through, finance and governance. Okay. So as I've said, the level of information that's going to be available will depend whether you are at commercialization stage or whether you're at construction stage. We clearly expect less at commercialization, because the whole point of commercialization is to address a lot of the areas that we're asking for information and try and firm up those to make the project or make sure that the project is strong and has no risk areas, or as minimum risk areas as possible. If you're at construction, though, we'd expect there to be relatively few things left to complete. Costs should be very firm. You should have, you should know really what your structure is for governance. You should know where you're getting or should have agreements in place for where you're getting your money from, the non-HNIP funding, and probably the only area that's commonly going to be still a bit unclear is the actual customers. And it's not that the customers are unclear, it's that people tend not to sign up to contracts until the network gets a bit closer. So again, we would expect to see that there aren't any holes in the scheme left by the time you get to construction ready project. Nothing that we're asking, you shouldn't really have difficulty in answering the questions when you get to construction phase of the project. Okay, next slide. So the first 2 categories are of information we're asking for is the stakeholders. As we've said, the most important is of the financial stakeholders is the paying customers. This is always a little bit tricky. Ideally, we'd like to see signed contracts with all the customers. Very rare to have those completed even by the time we get construction applications in, but there should be some contact and some information you can provide for where you are with negotiations with each of the customers. So at commercialization stage, we'd want to see evidence that you are in discussion with potential customers, that ideally you might have a memorandum of understanding or some sort of commitment in writing that your target customers are on board and are negotiating in good faith for a connection, to give us a feel that to make us feel confident that those customers are going to come forward, and that the estimate of heat sales and hence revenue are reasonable. If you're at construction, then we really would expect to have settled terms and not really be at the very least, you know, have heads of terms, and really we're looking for settled contract terms, and where possible signed contracts, but again that may not happen until during the construction phase. Again, evidence of what you're claiming is important to support the application form. For most of the other stakeholders will be to do with energy supply, and also there's things like planning and permissions to dig in roads and other issues. Heat pumps may well require EA approvals, and again, commercialization stage, we want to see where you are in the discussions. We want to see that you are engaging with people, with the various stakeholders, and not just you know, that you've actually had some contact and are on the journey towards the necessary contacts or permissions, contracts, sorry, or permissions. If you're at the construction stage, then again, we would expect things like heat takeoffs from energy from waste plants contracts. We'd expect to be pretty much at settled terms. We would expect EA to have at least said that your designs are okay, subject to the final detailed submission, things that will show that the necessary contracts and permissions are likely to be given or signed fairly soon, and the project is secure for what it needs in those respects. Next slide. Technically, again, as it says, it's about confidence. The level of design varies greatly with the approach you have to tendering. So what are you tendering? Are you tendering a concession? Are you tendering a D&B contract? Are you tendering a traditional build contract with a very detailed design during commercialization phase? All of these are, you know, the level of design just needs to be in line with the procurement route that you're following. What we don't want to see really is a very, you know, simple pencil sketch that suggests that you haven't really done any design work at all, because if you haven't done any design work, then, you know, that starts to bring into question some of the costs. Program is also important. So if you are asking for commercialization funding, then we want to see a commercialization program. Typically what people will do is provide a list of activities that they're going to undertake, the cost of those activities, and the dates that they intend to, or the range of dates they intend to undertake those, so that it's a sort of combined program and cost plan at the same time. But quite happy to receive a cost plan and program separately. What's important is that we get sufficient detail to be confident that the commercialization phase is deliverable within the timescales that you need to deliver it, and that the costs are that you're asking us to support are reasonable. Construction program. Clearly, if you are at construction stage, then we would expect you to have quite a good construction program, and again, sometimes this is subject to a D&B, so a D&B contractor will provide you with the very detailed program, but you should really have a good idea of the main construction phases at the very least. If you're in commercialization, the program is less certain, but in detail, but we would expect you to have identified target construction start dates of the main items and completion dates and heat on, so that we can at least get a flavour of when the construction phase is likely to start and how long it's likely to be, to see whether we think that's realistic. Clearly, if you have none of the information or don't provide any of that information, then we would have to question whether you're really in a position to actually deliver the project, and may well reject. Okay. So I'm not going to go into costs because we've already spoken about that in detail. Deliverability to finance and governance. So the questions are split into two sections, but basically we are looking for here we want to understand how money is going to, what the structure of your delivery is going to be, how the money is going to flow through that structure. So if you are setting up an SPV, but you're a local authority who's making the application, we want to see confirmation that you will be passing down any grant monies to the SPV. If you're at commercialization stage, then it would be unlikely that you would know what the structure of your SPV is, but if you're at construction, then we'd expect that to be that the SPV will actually be set up ready to receive the construction funding once awarded. We also want to understand, very importantly, where the non-HNIP funding is going to come from, and to see that it's sufficient for the project. So again, it might be that at commercialization you don't have exact information. So if you were going out to get market funding, you might not know who was going to supply you with that money, but we'd expect you to be able to recognize that that's your approach, that you're going out to the market for capital funding, and to have an idea of the sorts of organizations that you might be approaching. And ideally, some evidence that you've engaged with the market to understand what rates of return they want, so that supports your claimed project IRR that we're going to solve the FEAM to achieve. We've also got in there that a supplier of last resort. So because you're supplying energy to customers, should the company that does that, whether it's an SPV, whether it's an ESCO, should that company become insolvent or not be able to trade anymore, what's the plan for continuing to supply customers with heat? So again, at commercialization, we don't necessarily need to know who the supplier of last resort is, but we need to know that you're thinking about it and trying to work out how customers would be looked after in the event that that the network operator that's put in place ceases to trade. Clearly, again, if you can't actually provide us with any of that information, then that suggests that you haven't got to the level of development of the project that is needed really to deliver it. So again, will not be scoring highly. Okay, do you want me to talk to guidance and support?
Sure.
Yeah, okay. So we've mentioned business development managers. As somebody who's assessing projects, I cannot stress the importance of engaging with these development managers. Lauren Bright, Amy Fry are very good at helping people to identify what they need to work on to get their application into a good state for assessment. Those projects that have engaged with our BDM process generally put in much better quality applications than those that have not. So I can only encourage you strongly to contact Triple Point to get a BDM assigned to your project and to engage with them. There's also a huge number of publications that have been produced. We've already mentioned the application guidance, and there are a number of clarifications to those which have come out around particular issues that we've come across as we've actually gone through the various rounds. But again, if you do have, if you still have some issues or questions, then please do contact Triple Point or the BDM, and they will arrange. If they can't answer the question, they will arrange for either Simon, myself, or someone from one of the other partners to talk to you about the particular issue that you have.
Thank you, Peter. So that's the end of our presentation this morning. Thank you so much for joining this morning. As Peter said, please do reach out if you'd like to discuss your project in more detail with one of our BDMs. We're all available to answer any questions at a later date or set up one-to-one meetings. So thank you all very much for joining.